Whoa mama, Sleepless Tales here. We're going to be continuing quick without a preamble because I left it on a cliffhanger because it's going to be the last part. Don't forget to subscribe. Here we go. No, they did not bury me, though there is a period of time which I remember mistily, with a shuddering wonder, like a passage through some inconceivable world that had no hope in it and no desire. Now I found myself back in that sepulchral city, resenting the sight of people hurrying through the streets to filch a little money from each other, to devour their infamous cookery, to gulp their wholesome beer, to dream their insignificant and silly dreams. They trespassed upon my thoughts. They were intruders whose knowledge of life was to me an irritating pretense, because they felt so sure they could not possibly know the things that I knew. Their bearing, which was simply the bearing of commonplace individuals going about their business, in the assurance of perfect safety, was offensive to me, like the outrageous flauntings of folly in the face of danger it is unable to comprehend. I had no particular desire to enlighten them, but I had some difficulty in restraining myself from laughing in the faces so full of stupid importance. I dare say I was not very well at that time. I tottered about the streets. There were various affairs to settle, grinning bitterly at perfectly respectable persons. I admit my behavior was inexcusable. But then, my temperature was seldom normal in these days. My dear aunt's endeavors to nurse up my strength seemed altogether beside the mark. It was not my strength that wanted nursing. It was my imagination that wanted soothing. I kept the bundle of papers given to me by Kurtz, not knowing exactly what to do with it. His mother had died lately, and watched over, as I was told, by his intended, a clean-shaved man, with an official manner, and wearing gold-rimmed spectacles. He called on me one day and made inquiries, at first circuitous, afterwards suavely pressing, about what he is pleased to denominate certain documents. I was not surprised, because I had 2 rows with the manager on the subject out there. I had refused to give the smallest scrap out of that package, and I took the same attitude with the spectacled man. He became darkly menacing at last, and with much heat argued that the company had the right to every bit of information about its territories. And said he, Mr. Kurt's knowledge of unexplored regions must have been necessarily extensive and peculiar, owing to his great abilities and to the deplorable circumstances in which he had been placed. Therefore, I assured him Mr. Kurt's knowledge, however extensive, did not bear upon the problems of commerce or administration. He invoked the name of science. He would be an incalculable loss if, etc., etc. I offered him the report on suppression of savage customs, with a postscriptum torn off. He took it up eagerly, but ended up sniffing at it with an air of contempt. This is not what we had a right to expect, he remarked. Expect nothing else, I said. There are only private letters. He withdrew upon some threat of legal proceedings, and I saw him no more. But another fellow, calling himself Kurtz's cousin, appeared 2 days later, and was anxious to hear all the details about his dear relative's last moments. Incidentally, he gave me to understand that Kurtz had been essentially a great musician. There was the making of an immense success, said the man, who was an organist, I believe, with lank gray hair flowing over a greasy coat collar. I had no reason to doubt his statement, and to this day I am unable to say what was Kurt's profession, whether he had any, which was the greatest of his talents. I had taken him for a painter who wrote for the papers, or else for a journalist who could paint, but even the cousin, who took snuff during the interview, could not tell me what he had been exactly. He was a universal genius, and on that point I agreed with the old chap, who thereupon blew his nose noisily into a large cotton handkerchief and withdrew in a senile agitation, bearing off some family letters and memoranda about importance. Ultimately, a journalist anxious to know something of the fate of his dear colleague turned up. This visitor informed me Kurtz's proper sphere ought to have been politics on the proper side. He had fury straight eyebrows, bristly hair cropped short, an eyeglass on a broad button. He became expansive, and confessed his opinions that Kurtz really couldn't write a bit, but heavens, man, that guy could talk. He electrified large meetings. He had faith, don't you see? He had the faith. He could get himself to believe anything, did anything. He could have been a splendid leader of an extreme party. What party, I asked. Any party, answered the other. He was an extremist. Did I not think so? I assented. Did I know, he asked, with a sudden flash of curiosity, what it was that had induced him to go out there? Yes, said I, and forthwith handed him the famous report for publication, if he thought fit. He glanced through it hurriedly, mumbling all the time, judged what it would do, and took himself off with his plunder. And thus, I was left at last with a slim packet of letters and the girl's portrait. It struck me as beautiful. I mean, she had a beautiful expression. I know that sunlight can be made to lie, too. Yet, one felt that no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed the delicate shade of truthfulness upon those features. She seemed ready to listen without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought for herself. I concluded I would go and give her back her portrait and those letters myself. Curiosity? Yes. And also some other feelings, perhaps. All that had been Kurt's had passed out of my hands, his soul, his body, his station, his plans, his ivory, his career. There remained only his memory and his intended, and I wanted to give that up too, to the past in a way, to surrender personally all that remained of him with me to that oblivion which is the last word of our common fate. I don't defend myself. I had no clear perception of what it was I really wanted. Perhaps it was an impulse of unconscious loyalty, or the fulfillment of one of these ironic necessities that lurk in the facts of human existence. I don't know. I can't tell, but I went. I thought his memory was like the other memories of the dead that accumulate in every man's life, a vague impression, the brain of shadows that had fallen on it in their swift and final passage. But before the high and ponderous door, between the tall houses of street as still and decorous as a well-kept alley in a cemetery, I had a vision of him on the stretcher, opening his mouth voraciously, as if to devour all the earth and all of mankind. He lived then before me. He lived as much as he had ever lived, a shadow, insatiable of splendid appearances and of frightful realities, a shadow, darker than the shadow of the night, and draped nobly in the folds of gorgeous eloquence. The vision seemed to enter the house with me, the stretcher, the phantom bearers, the wild crowd of obedient worshippers, the gloom of the forests, the glitter of the reach between the murky bends, and the beat of the drum, regular and muffled, like the beating of a heart, the heart of a conquering darkness. It was a moment of triumph for the wilderness, an invading and vengeful rush which, it seemed to me, I'd have to keep back alone for the salvation of another soul. And the memory of what I had heard him say afar there, with the horned shapes stirring at my back, and the glow of the fires within the patient woods, those broken phrases came back to me, and were heard again in their ominous and terrifying simplicity. I remembered his abject pleading, his abject threats, the colossal scale of his vile desires, the meanness, the torment, the tempestuous anguish of his soul. And later on, I seemed to see his collected, languid manner. When he said one day, "This lot of ivory now is really mine," the company did not pay for it. I collected it myself at very great personal risk. I am afraid they'll try to claim it as theirs, though. It is a difficult case. What do you think I ought to do? Resist? I want no more than justice. He wanted no more than justice. No more than justice. I rang the bell before a mahogany door on the first floor, and while I waited, he seemed to stare at me out of the glassy panel. Stare with that wide and immense stare, embracing, condemning, loathing all the universe. I seemed to hear the whispered cry, "The horror, the horror." The dusk was falling. I had to wait in the lofty drawing room with 3 long windows from floor to ceiling that were like 3 luminous and bedraped columns. The bent gilt legs and backs of the furniture shone in indistinct curves. The tall marble fireplace had a cold and mementual whiteness. A grand piano stood massively in a corner, with dark gleams on the flat surfaces like a somber and polished sarcophagus. A high door opened. Closed. I rose. She came forward, all in black with a pale head, floating towards me in the dusk. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death, more than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she would remember and mourn forever. She took both my hands in hers and murmured, "I had heard you were coming." I noticed she was not very young, not girlish. She had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, and for suffering. The room seemed to have grown darker, as if all the sad light of the cloudy evening had taken refuge on her forehead. This fair hair, this pale visage, this pure brow seemed surrounded by an ashy halo, from which the dark eyes looked out at me. Their glance was guileless and profound, confident and trustful. She carried her sorrowful head, as though she were proud of that sorrow, as though she would say, I alone know how to mourn for him as he deserves. But, while we were still shaking hands, such a look of awful desolation came upon her face that I perceived she was one of those creatures that are not the playthings of time. For her, he had died only yesterday, and, by Jove, the impression was so powerful that, for me too, he seemed to have died only yesterday. Nay, this very minute. I saw her, and him in the same instant of time, his death and her sorrow. I saw her sorrow in the very moment of his death. Do you understand? I saw them together. I heard them together. She had said, with a deep catch of the breath, I have survived. What my strained ears seemed to hear distinctly, mingled with her tone of despairing regret, the summoning up whisper of his eternal condemnation. I asked myself what I was doing there, with a sensation of panic in my heart, as though I had blundered into a place of cruel and absurd mysteries not fit for a human being to behold. She motioned for me to a chair, and we sat down. I laid the packet gently on the little table, and she put her hand over it. You knew him well, she murmured, after a moment of mourning silence. Intimacy grows quickly out there, I said. I knew him as well as was possible for one man to know another. And you admired him, she said. It's impossible to know him and not to admire him, wasn't it? He was a remarkable man, I said, unsteadily. Then, before the appealing fixity of her gaze seemed to watch for more words on my lips, I went on. It was impossible not to love him, she finished eagerly, silencing me into an appalling dumbness. How true, how true. When you think that one knows him so well as I had all of his noble confidence. I knew him best. You knew him best, I repeated. And perhaps she did, but with every word spoken, the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and wide, remained illumined by the inextinguishable light of belief and love. You were his friend, she went on. His friend, she repeated, a little louder. You must have been, if he had given you this and sent you to me. I feel I can speak to you, and no, I must speak. I want you. You have heard his last words, to know that I have been worthy to him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth. He told me so himself, and since his mother died, I've had no one. I listened. The darkness deepened. I was not even sure whether he had given me the right bundle. I rather suspect he wanted me to take care of another batch of his papers, which, after his death, I saw the manager examining under the lamp, and the girl talked, using her pain in the certitude of sympathy. She talked as thirsty men drink. I had heard that her engagement with Kurtz had been disapproved of by her people. He wasn't rich enough for something, and indeed, I don't know whether he had been a pauper all his life. He had given me some reason to infer that it was impatience of comparative poverty that drove him out there. Who was not his friend who had heard him speak once, she was saying. He drew men towards him by what was best in them. She looked at me with intensity. It is the gift of the great, she went on, and the sound of her low voice seemed to have the accompaniment of all the other sounds, full of mystery, desolation, and sorrow. I had ever heard the ripple of the water, the soughing of the trees swayed by the wind, the murmur of the crowds, the faint ring of incomprehensible words cried from afar, and the whisper of a voice speaking from behind the threshold of the eternal darkness. What have you heard him, she cried. Yes, I know, I said with something like despair in my heart, but bowing my head before the faith that was in her, before that great and saving illusion that shone with the unearthly glow in the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself. What a loss to me. To us. And she corrected herself with beautiful generosity, then added in a murmur, to the world. By the last gleams of twilight, I could see the glitter of her eyes, full of tears that would not fall. I've been very happy, very fortunate, very proud, she went on. Too fortunate, too happy for a little while, and now I'm unhappy for life. She stood up. Her fair hair seemed to catch all the remaining light in a glimmer of gold, and I rose too. And of all this, she went on mournfully, of all his promise and all of his greatness, of his generous mind, of his noble heart, nothing remains. Nothing but a memory, you and I. We shall always remember him, I said hastily. No, she cried. It is impossible. Then all this should be lost. That such a life should be sacrificed to leave nothing but sorrow. You know what vast plans he had. I knew of them too. I could not perhaps understand, but the others knew of them. Something must remain. His words, at least, have not died. His words will remain, I said. And his example, she whispered to herself. Men looked up to him. His goodness shone in every act. His example. True, I said. His example, too. Yes, his example. I forgot that. But I do not. I cannot believe, not yet. I cannot believe that I shall never see him again. That nobody will see him again. Never, never, never. She put out her arms, as if after a retreating figure, stretching them back and with clasped pale hands across the fading and narrow sheen of the window. Never see him. I saw him clearly enough then. And I shall see this eloquent phantom as long as I live, and I shall see her, too, a tragic and familiar shade, resembling in this gesture another one, tragic also, and bedecked with powerful charms, stretching bare down across arms over the glitter of the eternal stream, the stream of darkness. She said suddenly, very low, "He died as he lived." "His end," said I, with dull anger stirring in me, "was in every way worthy of his life." "And I was not with him," she murmured. My anger subsided before a feeling of infinite pity. "Everything that could be done," I mumbled. But I believed in him more than anyone on earth, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. I would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sign, and every glance. I felt like a chill grip on my chest. "Don't," I said, in a muffled voice. "Forgive me. I have mourned so long in silence, You were with him, and to the last. I think of his loneliness. Nobody near to understand him as I would have understood. Perhaps no one to hear. To the very end," I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. "Repeat them," she murmured in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with." I was on the point of crying at her. "Don't you hear them?" The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly, like the first whisper on a rising wind. The horror! The horror! His last word to live with, she insisted. "Don't you understand? I loved him. I loved him. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was, "Your name." I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still, and stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry. By the cry of inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain. I knew it. I was sure. She knew. She was sure. I heard her weeping. She had hidden her face in her hands. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head, but nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, I wonder, if I had rendered Kurtz that injustice which was due? Hadn't he said he only wanted justice? But I couldn't. I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether. Marlowe ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. "We have lost the first of the ebb," said the director suddenly. I raised my head. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky. It seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. And guys, that is the end of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I hope you deeply enjoyed it, because I did. It sure was fun to read, and I hope that you enjoyed me reading it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and kibble and come and tipple. If you have any recommendations for other things you'd like to be read, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to get around to them, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Have the book talk in the discussion. Also, guys, here's the book review after this. Book review, guys. Let's hear it. Young Sleepless Tales is telling you what he thinks of Part of Markness by Joseph Conrad. It was good. It was very well written. There was no issues, what's the word I'm looking for? He wasn't fumbling with vocabulary in an unbelievably annoying way. Books from this time period use the big words that I'm just like, huh? What does that mean? When they say, oh, inscrutable loquacity, and I'm just like, yes, right? But didn't pull that off too much. It all seemed very apt and fitting, but there's a lot of things in this that just, like, the plot points just seemed kind of glossed over. I don't get it. Like, he was just like even at the end, the narrator was saying, oh, it felt like the heavens was falling on me, but I did not really see the gravity of this, final scene with his wife or whatever. And there's a lot of points in this where the narrator seemed to just believe that there's an unbelievable weight to a lot of things that was, one, not described, and two, not even mentioned, other than, oh, there was weight, right? Which is like, okay, that's lame. That's kind of piss poor writing, but whatever. They can't all be winners, I guess. You want like a number rating out of this? Pretty good as far as they go. If I were to rate it out of 3, what's a good number system? I've never rated anything before. Yeah, let's say out of 10. Out of 10? Okay. I'm going to give you, what's the term? I came up with this term a couple years ago called the Game Informer rating system. It's 1 out of 10. And on Game Informer, they'll be like, oh, this game's amazing. It's 7 out of 10. But what that actually means is it's actually between the range of 5 to 10. I've never seen Game Informer rate anything lower than 5. So if it's 7 out of 10, that actually means it's 2 out of 5, which means it sucks. Games that are 9 out of 10, they're actually 4 out of 5. Pretty good. I would rate this one as a probably solid 3 out of 5, TBH. It was good. But again, I just did not even comprehend a lot of the plot points, and I was just like, well, maybe if I read it more closely, maybe I'll take a brief look at the cliff notes after this. But besides that, it was all right. Very all right. Starting this, I thought that Heart of Darkness, I thought this was going to be like a Lovecraft thing. I didn't know that Heart of Darkness meant, African village. That seems kind of, not what I expected, but whatever. So be it, right? You can't ask for too much more from a book of this time period. They got to say something just fucking unbelievably racist, random in the middle, It's come to expect it after a while. But anyways, this is Sleepless Tales as always. Don't forget to subscribe and the nipple and the rest of the things that I said. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And if you're going to bed listening to this, then good night. And I love you. And I'll see you in the next series. Goodbye.